Dear colleagues, dear listeners, hi everyone. Nice to see you here on the seminar New Ideas in Philosophy by the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies and the Department of History of the French Philosophy of the Moscow State University. Today we are going to discuss the new book that is forthcoming by Daniel Stoljar, The Introspection Principle, Rationalism about Knowledge of Consciousness. And Daniel is here with us today. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. We will start with a brief introductory speech by Daniel, presenting the main ideas of the book, and then we will go on to the discussion part. So, Daniel, please.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for organizing this. It's great to be talking to you. And the first thing I should say is that the book is basically a product of an early series of talks we gave in this very venue during the pandemic, if you'll remember. So I went through the basic ideas. So I'm hoping that some of you will be familiar with it, but if not, that doesn't matter. But anyway, I just wanted to extend my thanks for allowing me, what is that, about 5 years ago, to go through those ideas. It was extremely helpful, and the book is now going to be coming out. So thanks very much. So the basic idea of the book is, as the subtitle suggests, to give a sort of rationalist, what I call a rationalist or account of introspection. And the basic idea is I guess we can think of the basic idea as having two main parts. The first part says that ordinary rational agents, and we ordinary agents insofar as we're rational, have certain kinds of capacities or dispositions, and in particular dispositions to believe that we're in conscious states if we're in them, at least under certain circumstances and within certain kinds of limits. So that's just an assumption about what rationality is like. It's a bit like saying that rational agents and we ordinary agents, insofar as we're rational, have dispositions not to have contradictory beliefs, for example, or dispositions to accept the testimony of the senses, to accept what your perception, what it seems to you to be the case in perception. So the idea is that we can identify a certain kind of rational disposition that we have if we're in conscious states. So that's the first part of the account. And the second part of the account says that we can use that fact, assuming it to be a fact, we can use it to explicate what introspection is. And so in particular, an introspective belief is simply a belief that is a manifestation of that kind of disposition. It's just a belief to the effect that you're in a certain sort of psychological state formed in that way. It's the outcome of that kind of disposition. And it's a justified belief because it's a belief that's the outcome of a certain kind of rational disposition. If it amounts to knowledge, then it's a case of introspective knowledge. So it's really those two parts. It's a claim about what kinds of dispositions rational agents have and what kind of dispositions we have insofar as we ordinary agents are rational. And secondly, it's a claim about clarifying questions about what introspection is in the light of that. Now, in the book, what I do is I formulate the idea in the way that I've just done in terms of dispositions to respond to conscious states and explicating introspection in terms of that. But I also explicate it in terms of a principle of rationality, which I call an introspection principle, or the introspection principle. So that's where I get the title from. And the general idea is that if we can think about rationality somewhat on the model of competence with a natural language. So in particular, you can think of a rational agent as someone who abides by certain kinds of principles And if you think about it that way, it's kind of useful because you can then focus directly on the principle. So if a rational agent, for example, might abide by a no contradiction principle that says don't have contradictory beliefs, or at least not under certain circumstances. And of course, if a rational agent does that, then they will have certain dispositions. And it's an interesting theoretical question as to whether the principles are first or the dispositions are first. I don't get into that in the book, though I do focus a lot on the principles because it's useful. Principles are useful in a way that dispositions are not. You can write down a principle on a whiteboard in your office and wonder about its structure and so forth. So it's kind of useful for purposes of analysis. But it's not necessary. One could formulate the issue in either way. But if one does formulate it in terms of a principle, then the thesis is, again, the basic idea of the book is, again, to have two parts. The first part says there's an introspection principle, which is supposed to be a principle of rationality, which says that if you're in a conscious state, then believe that you are in that state. So it's a principle that tells you what you should believe in a certain context, namely a context in which you're in a conscious state. And then it says that you have a capacity to introspect, or if and only if you abide by the principle. And so it connects the principle with the phenomena of introspection. So that's the basic idea. And what I do in the book is I first sort of set this out, explain certain things about the principle, like what notion of consciousness is at issue, for example, how we might understand the principle exactly, comparing it with other principles of rationality. I also contrast it with well-known, throughout the book, I contrast it with well-known alternative approaches to introspection in philosophy. Like the most famous one is the perceptual model, which says that we should think about our relation to our own conscious states on the model of perception, and that we should come to know it. We will come to know about those states roughly as we come to know about objects in our environment that we perceive. And I'm sort of opposed to that view. In being opposed to that view, that's a very unoriginal with me. That's a very common actually in philosophy of mind to be opposed to that view. In fact, it's so common that people very rarely even say that they hold that view, even though I suspect underneath they do. But people reject that view. In my own way of thinking about it, I don't claim that the rationalist account is inconsistent with that view. In fact, you can combine the two positions quite readily. What I do claim is that there's no reason to go on to say that your relation to conscious states is akin or like the relation that you bear to objects that you perceive. That would be, there's no reason to say that in order to accommodate the phenomena of introspection. So for me, the main problem with the perceptual approach isn't that it's inconsistent with my approach, it's that you can in fact add it if you want, but there just isn't any theoretical pressure to do so. And throughout the book, I also discuss various other views which are somewhat like the perceptual view. The most famous one being a kind of an acquaintance view, which is a much more contemporary view, much more common. And I try to argue in the book that there are various problems with that view, but one of the main ones is the same as the problem with the perceptual view, which is that, yeah, you can add it if you want, but there's just no need. It just doesn't help you in any way and creates lots of problems. I also, of course, compare the rationalist view with various other views, like an inferential proposal, for example, or various constitutivist, so-called constitutivist proposals. I should say, with respect to the constitutivist proposal, that the person who's most prominently associated with the rationalist view, namely Sidney Shoemaker, held it in a particular form. And one thing I do in the book is point out that that form, while interesting, is in retrospect not very plausible, and it's much more plausible to adopt the version of the rationalist account I'm interested in. The main difference is that for a Shoemaker, belief that you're in a conscious state is necessitated by the conscious state plus the fact that you're rational. There's a straightforward metaphysical necessitation. Whereas on the view that I prefer, we should think of introspective belief as pretty much a manifestation of a rational disposition rather than something that's merely necessitated by being rational. So it's a reasonably subtle distinction, but I think it's quite an important one, and it distinguishes the proposal that I'm interested in from the one that Shoemaker is interested in. Okay, and then so what I've been telling you is about basically what the view is. The bulk of the book, which I won't go through, but the bulk of the book consists of applying this theory to a whole lot of problems that come up in the wide literature on introspection. And one of the reasons I'm attracted to this view is because it turns out that if you look at the literature on introspection, that just a whole lot of puzzles and problems of various kinds. And what I think, and what the book is kind of written in the conviction that this is true, is that basically this sort of proposal basically deals with all of those problems. And that's a very good reason to believe that it's true. Now, other theories deal with some of the problems, but I don't think they deal with all of them, partly because some of the problems are generated by objections to those very theories. But that's the bulk of the book, that I just go through a whole series of problems ranging from questions about evidence, questions about transparency, questions about privileged access, questions about externalism, questions about knowledge of inference or reasoning, whether we can know that by introspection, questions about revelation, which is interesting for philosophy of mind, which is basically the question about whether we can know not simply that you're in a conscious state, but what the nature of those conscious states are. And then finally, I end with some issues about introspective knowledge of the self, when I basically say that the rationalist account can accept cogito reasoning without accepting the Humean view that, and at the same time also accepting, I should say, the Humean view that we don't come to know by introspection that the self exists, at least if that requires us to be acquainted with the self. So you can sort of agree with two big traditions, the Cartesian tradition and the Humean tradition. And that's pretty much where I am. So I think that I hope that's sufficient to get the discussion going, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. We will start with Vadim Vasilyev. So, Vadim, please, you have your 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Glad to see you. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting and dense, interesting, brilliant book. It is rich in content, and I am sure that I will certainly return to it many times. In my brief remarks, I will first raise one general objection, or as a concern of worry, not quite an objection, actually. Then mention that I feel what is missing from the book. And finally pose two specific questions. So let me start. My general objection, if I may call it that. The central point of your book is that the faculty of introspection is part of human rationality, as you just said. But how does this square with the fact that such highly irrational people as schizophrenics are quite prone to introspection in the form of so-called hyper-reflexivity as a kind of exaggerated self-consciousness? Is it not a problem for you, at least a worry for you? That's first point. Second point, what I feel is missing. While you just told us about traditions in treating of introspection, in fact, if I myself didn't miss anything, there is no explicit discussion, even maybe not even explicit, but even brief discussion of the history of the classical theories of introspection. And I think that the book would have benefited from this. because as far as I can tell, that history was fascinating and instructive. And my two specific points. On page 46, you're right. I quote, beliefs, for example, are paradigmatic deliberative states. I was puzzled with this statement. Do you really believe this, or was it a kind of sleep? Do you really believe that our beliefs are up to us? Is it really up to me to believe that 2 plus 2 are 5? Is it up to me to believe this? And my last point, elsewhere you express a doubt that pain is a mental state. Pain is a mental state. Can you explain? I understand approximately what do you mean, but can you really explain this briefly? Thank you for your book and for your attention.
Sorry, the last point is that I expressed doubt that pain is a mental state.
Yes, in one place
Okay.
of your book you say that.
Oh,
Maybe
no.
maybe you mean localization of pain. Yes, probably,
I
but
understand.
it's
Yeah, I
yes.
understand it. Okay, terrific. Those are fantastic and very challenging questions, Vadim. So thank you very much, and thanks so much for reading the book and thinking about it. I really appreciate it. Let me see if I can say something. First of all, perhaps on the history point, you're quite right, of course, that the history of this is extremely interesting. One thing I found in writing this book that I already had too many balls in the air. I was trying to do too many things because I was trying to cover all of these topics. And so I felt that dealing with the history would be just a mistake and I wouldn't come across as if I knew what I was talking about. So I basically made a decision not to worry at all really about the history. I mean, of course, I make a few remarks, but nothing in any serious way about what the history of introspection or self-knowledge might amount to. So I just, it's not at all that I don't think that's interesting. It's just that I think it would have made the book much, much longer and more unwieldy than it is. So that's really the only reason I didn't discuss that. But I do think that that's, of course, a very important area to look at. On the schizophrenic issue, I take it your point is that, you might say people who suffer from schizophrenia can nevertheless introspect. So how can it be that introspection is a part of rationality, since people who suffer schizophrenia are presumably not rational? Yes, that's a very good challenge. I mean, there are various things I can say in reply. One is people who suffer schizophrenia are not rational in some ways, but it isn't the case that they're not rational in every way. So, for example, suppose we go back to the picture of rationality that I'm operating with, where to be rational is to abide by the principles of rationality. Now, there's a lot of ways of interpreting that phrase. For one thing, abiding by the principles of rationality might be something that comes in degree. So we, for example, talk about fully abiding by the principles, always abiding. We use words like that, which make it clear that we have in mind a kind of case without exceptions. Okay. Now you could, in fact, modify that to talk about, say, well, you're rational if you abide mostly or not. These are important because schizophrenics might be people who don't abide in certain cases by the principles of rationality, but in other cases they do. Another area of source of complexity is that, of course, we've got different principles of rationality, so that schizophrenics may fail to abide by some of the principles and nevertheless abide by others of the principles. So that's one way in which I could try to accommodate the possibility, and to say, yeah, schizophrenics fail to be rational, but they don't fail to be rational insofar as they introspect. They don't fail to be rational in the way that I have in mind. just as they don't fail to be rational in many other ways too. Like, for example, it's notoriously the case that for certain people who suffer schizophrenia, they're reasonably bad at forming beliefs, but they're quite good at coherence principles on beliefs, so that they reasoning from one belief to another might be something that they can do, even though they form beliefs very badly. So that's one thing I can say, but it isn't, I think, the only thing I can say in this case. I could say also, I mean, I don't actually say this probably as explicitly as I should, so this is why your question is a very good one. But in a way, I'm interested in a rather limited phenomenon, like coming to know that you're in a kind of certain kind of state. And if you come to know that you're in a certain kind of state, there's much of what we think of as introspection or what we think of as self-knowledge that is not so far addressed. And that may well be a matter of inference from more basic things that we come to know by introspection. In chapter 4, I introduced the notion of, I distinguish mediated from unmediated introspection and say that I'm interested in the unmediated case. The mediated case is a case where you know by inference from something that you already know by introspection. And I point out that the forms of inference can actually, there can be multiple forms of inference there. So there can be very trivial inferences, but there can also be much richer inferences that draw on other sources of information, for example, a capacity for folk psychology. And so it could be that people who are schizophrenic are capable of forming beliefs about their own states, but they may not be using introspection in the sense that I mainly have in mind. They may be using other forms of other modes of coming to know these things. For example, applications of folk psychology to themselves. That's certainly a possibility. And so, for some of these issues, I will try to say, yeah, they can come to know things about themselves, but not by introspection in the way that I have in mind, or at least that's a possibility. Notice that I'm not forced into saying that because, as I say, the mere fact that an agent isn't rational in some respect doesn't mean that they're not rational in this respect. And even if they were, that doesn't mean that they can't come to know things about themselves via other routes. It'll just mean that they don't come to know them in this particular way. That's the way that I try to deal with that that issue. Did you want to say anything more about that issue before I turn to your other questions?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for explanation.
Okay. So then belief, do I really mean that beliefs are deliberate states where I think you interpret me there as saying that it's kind of up to us whether we believe something or not. I guess I didn't mean that by the phrase deliberate state, but I can see that it had that overtone, and you might have interpreted it that way, but that isn't quite what I meant. What I meant was only that beliefs are states which, in effect, you can have a reason to be in or a reason not to be in. And
I see.
I was saying, yes, that's true of beliefs and that's true of intentions. But there are many psychological states for which that isn't obviously true, like sensations, imagination, emotions, perhaps, well, maybe emotions aren't like that actually. But so that's why when I said beliefs are paradigmatically deliberative, I meant they're paradigmatically the kind of state that you can have a reason to be in and not be in. And the reason I mention that there is because there are certain proposals in the philosophy of introspection that obviously are restricted to that kind of state. So they basically only work for the kind of state that you can have a reason to be in or a reason not to be in. And they just simply don't apply to other kinds of states. And what I say is, no, I want a theory that applies to all manner of states. And ideally, I want a theory that applies to the deliberative states in that sense, and also to non-deliberative states. And that's the theory I end up offering. So that's what I meant by that. So yes, I do believe that beliefs are deliberative states, but not in the sense that you meant. I don't think it's up to us what we believe. No, clearly not. even if you just you end up with some beliefs because of, you've somehow, perhaps because it's an innate belief, or perhaps because you've just picked it up somehow from your culture, and it's nothing that you really thought about. It's still the case that the thing that you've ended up with, a belief, is the kind of state that you can have a reason to be in or not have a reason to be in, even though you got it through some causal process that had nothing to do with you, I think. Let's see, on the issue of pain. So yes, pain is not a mental state. I think you're referring to the part of the book where I draw a distinction between two ways of talking about pain, at least in English, where on the one hand, we sometimes locate pains in parts of the body. So you say, I have a pain in my thumb. And then sometimes we mean pain as a state that a person can be in. And if the second is in play, then I think, yes, pains are mental states. In fact, I think they're paradigmatic mental states. Whereas if you mean pain understood as the thing that is in your thumb, then it's not really a state, for the reason that it's a kind of, it's, at least if your metaphysics is driven by the language you're speaking there, you would think of it as an object, because we tend to treat it like an object. So it's saying, I have a pain in my thumb, is a bit like saying I have a coin in my pocket, where a coin is some object that you have in your pocket that has some properties. It's not a state, it's just an object. And if you think of a pain as something in your thumb, then you would assimilate it to that case. I think, I don't think that's, I don't think that notion of pain is in a way a crucial one for my purposes, but it's only in that sense that pain is not a mental state. In the other sense, in which a person feels pain, or a person is in the condition of having pain, that then pain is clearly a mental state, and we can come to know by introspection that we're in it. So that's roughly where I think that's the part of the book that you were referring to, and that's what I had in mind there.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Artem Besedin, please.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Artem. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Dan. Okay, I have a question. Thank you for this very comprehensive book. That's very useful presentation of the main. I think mainly, maybe not only the main, but to all topics in the metaphysics of introspection. And my question is related to your concept of rationality. Once in the book, you say that your concept of rationality is applicable to animals. And this is, I think, this may be a serious problem to this rationalist account. Because when we speak about human rationality, we usually mean that rationality is being developed. I mean that people are not born rational, or maybe you think differently. I mean that newborns grow up and they are educated and they become rational beings. And if we think about animals, what can we say about them? Do they grow up and become rational, or are they born rational? And both variants, both options are not too good, because human rationality is being developed in a society. You need some very complex process for developing, for rationality being developed. We do not find anything like that in animals. On the other hand, if we say that animals are born rational, that's a that's a problem that we meet quite often. That animals are they have some innate capacities that humans do not. That animals seem to be much smarter than humans from their birth, and human babies are not as smart at the beginning as animal babies even. Okay, but this is my initial
Yeah.
point, and another point that I would make, and maybe you will not agree with it, is that rationality is a social matter. I mean that it is essentially social. And then your concept of introspection presupposes that only social beings are capable of this kind of knowledge. This is maybe okay. I mean that if we accept that knowledge is not just introspection, but knowledge itself is has some normative part, has some social dimension, then this is not a problem for introspection. This is an implication of knowledge. But then again, this concept of rationality is not applicable to animals. And the third issue concerns other types of agents. What about the artificial agents? So if you have when you give this concept of rationality, do you want to say that when we make a rational agent, then it automatically has this disposition for introspection? Or do we need to engineer it in some way? When we make a rational agent, we need specifically to introduce there a disposition for introspection, or are artificial agents capable at all of this capacity? I mean that your analysis is well applicable to human case. But to understand something, it's a good question how we can create this phenomenon, this thing ourselves. And this is my
Yeah.
general worry, how we can go beyond
Yes.
what came.
Yeah. Look, those are again terrific questions. Maybe I can answer them in reverse order. So the last one was about AI, and the second one was about the social nature of rationality, and the first one was about animals. On the third one about AI, yeah, I don't think it's true that if you built an AI, uh, that they would automatically, even if they were rational, that they'd automatically have a capacity for introspection, roughly because when we say that an agent is rational, it's left open to what extent. This is related to some of the things I was just saying to Vadim, but it's left open to what extent they are rational, and there has to be some range of principles they abide by, and they must abide by those principles to some degree. But it's possible that you are not rational in a particular kind of way. So, for example, take an agent who doesn't have contradictory beliefs and abides by that principle, but in some ways, doesn't coordinate belief and intention. Or, sorry, let me put it another way. Suppose you have an agent who doesn't really coordinate belief and intention in the way that we think of as rational, but in all other respects abides by the principles of rationality. Would we call the agent rational or not? Well, I mean, I don't mind in a sense. I don't think one should get too kind of excited about that, but I think it would be perfectly natural to say that the agent is rational, but perhaps not rational in every respect. And so I think it's perfectly possible for us to build an AI. Incidentally, I'm somewhat of a skeptic about contemporary AI, so I don't think we have built such AIs, but nevertheless, I do think it's perfectly possible that you could build an AI which doesn't have a capacity for introspection. It just wouldn't be rational in all the ways that I have in mind. And so in particular, if we wanted to build one that had a capacity for introspection, you would have to build it so that it had the particular rational disposition that I have in mind. So yes, I think you would have to build it in that way. And I don't think it follows immediately just from ordinary process of rationality that your introspection. Actually, this is an important point, really, because there are kind of rationalist approaches to introspection that are not quite like mine insofar as they think a capacity for introspection follows from ordinary rational capacities. Shoemaker actually held a view of that kind, as I understand him, so that if you had an agent who had a capacity to, not have contradictory beliefs or to believe the consequences of their beliefs or coordinate belief and perception, Shoemaker sometimes speaks as if that by itself is sufficient for you to have a capacity for introspection. But that actually isn't the proposal that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a specific principle that you have to abide by. And if you were building an AI, you'd have to make it the case that they abide by that principle in order for them to have a capacity for introspection on this account. So yeah, I think my answer to the question about AI is yes, you would have to build it. You couldn't just assume. Yeah,
And
sure, go ahead. Yeah.
how exactly
Oh.
we will do it?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question, but it's still, it seems to me that, I mean, at one point in the book I say, well, isn't there, just forgetting about AI for a minute, but isn't there a story in we human beings who are rational and abide by things? There must be a story in cognitive science or neuroscience or something about what these dispositions are. And I say, of course, there's a story like that, but I'm not in a position to tell you that story, and I'm not even going to try to tell you that story. But what I would say is that if we knew what that story was, I think it's quite plausible to think it will be some kind of computational theory. And we don't know what it is, but it's going to be something like that. That seems like a reasonable extrapolation from contemporary theories. And if we do have such a theory, then there isn't anything in principle wrong with mechanizing it. It's just that we have no real idea about what that theory is. And that's for me, that's a sort of an area which, this this topic, like many other topics in philosophy, there's just so many huge issues surrounding you, and you want to just move through. So in that particular case, I'm like the tourist operator saying to the tourists, yes, over here we have this huge problem about what the cognitive science and the neuroscience of rationality, and particularly introspection in this case, is. We're not going to go into that today. We're going to continue on this way. So that's what I would say. And so it's, as far as I can see, AI, we should think about AI in a way that piggybacks on our best theories of these things. And so what we should really do is think, to build an AI, like, for example, suppose you're trying to build an AI that has a capacity for perception. How would you do that? Well, in my view, what you do is you think, okay, let's think of the human capacity for perception, or perhaps the mammalian capacity, or perhaps the avian capacity in birds, and have a kind of computational theory of what perception consists in. And then once you've got that theory, yeah, you could implement it in an artificial system. But if you don't have such a theory, you're not really in any position to do it. So I guess I think the issue is sort of structurally like that. But yeah, so when you say how, I say, excellent question. I don't have an answer to that question, but on the other hand, I refuse to be embarrassed by not having an answer to that question. Okay, let's see. The second one was about the social nature of rationality. I mean, you mentioned both the social nature and the normative nature of rationality. I do think that rationality has a normative nature. I mean, I use the word ought and should all the time, and those are standard ways of expressing norms. Norms seem to be things that, I think I do say at one point that norms are things that you just express with words like, you ought to blah, 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 blah. You ought to have white wine with fish or something like that. These are norms of some kind. And so I do think it's normative. I don't myself see the pressure to say that it's social, though I do agree with you that many people think that it's social. partly, and I don't get into that at all in the book, partly because I never quite know when people say that it's social, whether they mean that you couldn't be rational unless you were in a group that interacted in a particular way, or they mean that you couldn't be rational unless you had views about what other people might say to you. So in other words, it's whether the social element is built into the content of the property, like it's built into the content of the relevant beliefs that you must have if you're rational, or it's built into the very nature of rationality itself, insofar as it's sort of like, like a famous example is being an accountant. There's a sense in which a person cannot be an accountant unless there's a whole set of social relations that they're in, such that those social relations obtain, and if those social relations didn't obtain, then they're an accountant. If they didn't obtain, then they couldn't be an accountant. That sort of thing is, I think, not that plausible about rationality. I don't really see why you couldn't be a rational agent independently. But it is plausible that rationality requires you to have views about what other people think and so forth. And that's just a view about what the nature of the beliefs are. But still, the principles that I have in mind seem to me to be the kind of thing which could apply in an agent, and an agent could abide by them, just as if the agent was independent from a social situation. I did say at one point that the way I'm thinking about rationality is analogous to the way that I'm thinking about language, the way that some people think about language. And of course, people think about language somewhat in the way that you were sketching. They think of it as a social phenomenon. And I guess I think, of course, empirically, yes, it's a social phenomenon. But I don't necessarily think that metaphysically it's a social phenomenon. It seems to me that an agent could abide by certain rules of language independently. And the same thing would be true for rationality. So that's roughly where I'm sitting with that sort of issue. To say that it's social could mean various things, and some of the things it could mean seem okay, and some of them don't seem okay. But that's roughly where I am. But as you mentioned actually in your question, if it really did have a social element, if you really in the case of language, sometimes people talk about communitarian theories of language, which mean that you can't actually speak a language unless you're in a group that does certain things, unless you're in a kind of community. And maybe rationality is like that. I don't myself make that assumption. I'm not hugely friendly to that assumption. But as you said, it wouldn't be terrible if it were true. It would just mean that the theory would have that consequence. What about animals? I can tell you why I say that it applies to animals. And that is because animals seem to me to actually abide by some of the principles of rationality even better than we human beings do. Maybe this is kind of what you had in mind at some point. I mean, for example, animals don't seem to succumb to having inconsistent beliefs in quite the way that we do. They do seem to coordinate their beliefs and their perceptions in very straightforward ways. They don't wonder to themselves whether it, like Macbeth, is it really a dagger I see before me? They don't wonder that. They just think, okay, I perceive a dagger, so I believe that there is a dagger. So they do coordinate beliefs and perceptions in the way that we think are rational. Of course, animals so I think animals are actually, by the standards of rationality that I have in mind, they're quite rational. And in fact, they're more likely to be rational than we ordinary human beings are. And the reason for that, I take it, is that we're basically vastly more complicated than animals. And so that the capacity for things to go wrong is sort of more extreme in our case. That isn't to say, though, that I think animals introspect in the sense that I have in mind, because in order to introspect in the sense that I have in mind, lots of background things have to be true. You have to have, you have to be able to form the relevant beliefs. It has to matter to you that you're in the beliefs and all that sort of thing. That the beliefs are true, I'm sorry. And that just obviously isn't true for animals mostly. I mean, maybe it's true for some. It doesn't. I'm not taking a stand on the nature of animal cognition or anything. But certainly principal animals could easily fail to introspect by the standards that I'm operating with. So it is true that the notion of rationality that I have in mind applies to animals, but it isn't true that that follows from that animals introspect.
Thank you.
Artyom, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank
Evgeny
you.
Loginov, please.
Hello, Danil. Thank you very
Hello.
much for hello. Thank you very much for this very rich book. So I have four, I guess, points. My first point is that when we are talking about introspection and any other way of knowing, we may be interested in a reliability question or maybe in a responsibilistic one. So the first kind of question is about the mechanism of cognition. How exactly do we know how we get this knowledge? What is the metaphysics of this knowledge? And the second type of question is a question about normativity. Why it is knowledge at all? And it seems to me that rationalistic approach you propose is kind of the answer to the second question, not an answer to the first question, because you actually don't discuss the metaphysics or the structure of the mechanism of inner cognition. Is it right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
the second question is about when you discuss the problem of diaphanous, you take it from the refutation of idealism by Moore, and then you say that it is not your point, you are not interested in discussing the success of original Moore argument against idealism. It's totally understandable because of the topic of the book, but I'm just interested, do you think it is success argument or not? Is it persuasive, and so on?
Yeah.
So the second point is again about Moore, but not about refutation of idealism, but Moorean argument against illusionism by Chalmers. At summer school, you use this argument against illusionism, and as far as I understand in the book, you didn't use it. Do you change your mind about the persuasiveness of this argument, or maybe I just missed the discussion in the book? So, and my last point, again, is about illusionism. You presented your own argument against illusionism in the book. You presented it earlier at summer school. So, your point is, as far as I get it, that feeling pain, uh, if illusionists say that feeling pain is a property F, it is not true because they should deny that we can be in pain. They should say that no one really is in pain. So that is implausible. Then you conclude that illusionism is wrong. As far as I understand, Frankish or Kammerer's point of view, that they will say that we feel pain, but in a functional sense, or maybe in normative sense, but not in a phenomenological sense. So they will say that feeling pain is actually a property of F, and this property um, meets the condition 1, 2, and 3 you propose. So that's my question, and what do you think
Yes,
about
very
the book?
good. So let's see. So there's a question, just to summarize, there's the first set of questions was about the reliability, whether I say anything about the mechanism of introspection, or
Yes,
whether I'm interested in the more normative issues.
yes.
And the second one was about um, the question about
Idealism.
the relation between diaphanousness and idealism.
Yes.
Yes, yes. And the third was the why I don't use the Moorean argument against illusionism. And the fourth one was about yeah, basically you were offering a kind of response on behalf of the illusionist to the argument that I gave. Yeah.
Correct.
Is that the, okay, yeah. Yeah, on the first, the mechanisms, yes, I don't, there could be various things that is meant by a mechanism. One thing that could be meant by a mechanism would be a theory of the kind that I was just talking about with Artem, which is something like, yes, there's a theory, if we suppose just provisionally that we do in fact, that first of all, rational agents have these capacities that I'm talking about, and that we ordinary agents have them too because we are close enough approximations to the ideal, so we have them as well. Then of course there's some story at the cognitive, some sort of story in cognitive science or neuroscience or something about why in fact we have this, and it will be some account of our belief forming practices and why we abide by these rules and so on and so forth. And as I've already said, that isn't something I want to get into if that's what is meant by a mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
If you mean by a mechanism, so partly because those are empirical questions which are not, I want to set aside. If you mean something else by a mechanism, like for example, are there processes that support counterfactuals about going from conscious states to beliefs about those states, then I think in some sense or other I have provided such a mechanism, because if it is true that we are conscious, as I'm assuming that we are conscious, we're in conscious states, and if it's true that we're rational in the relevant sense, then there will be counterfactual supporting generalizations to be made about what someone is likely to believe given that they're in a certain kind of conscious state. Of course, that's a very abstract kind of sense of a mechanism. It's just simply a generalization from the picture I've already given, pointing out that that picture supports counterfactuals and law-like generalizations and so forth. But it doesn't really provide what people often call a mechanism, which would be kind of nuts and bolts theory about why this thing go to that. And it would be lovely to have such a theory, but that strikes me as not something which certainly I can provide. To be honest with you, I don't think anybody is in a position to provide that at the moment. So that's another reason why I'm not that embarrassed that I don't provide it myself. So that's what I would want to say about that issue. It is true that I'm interested more in the normative issues. I mean, I thought actually when you started talking, you were going to ask me a slightly different question, which is related to my interest in the normativity issue, which is roughly why even if you abide by the principle and you end up with this belief, is it a justified belief? Because after all, you can abide by principles of rationality and end up with certain beliefs and they're not justified. For example, if you abide by the principle, don't have contradictory beliefs, and that means you end up with one belief rather than another, that doesn't tell you that the belief that you end up with is a justified belief. That's a further issue entirely. And so I have some work to do there in moving from the picture that we're abiding by certain principles of rationality to the normative claims. I have to say something like, this principle yields justified beliefs basically because it's rather like a perception principle. The perception principle says something like, if you perceive an object in front of you, then you really should believe that there's an object in front of you, given background conditions and so on. And that principle does plausibly yield justified beliefs. And so I want to say that the introspection principle is rather like that, even though there are other principles of rationality that don't have that property. So I am interested in the normativity, and it's a slightly non-trivial matter for me to say why, but I'm not interested in the mechanistic kind of explanation as to why we do it. Not because my saying I'm not interested in it sounds as if I'm, I don't think it's important or something. I do think it's extremely important. It's just something that I don't think I can make a contribution to. And moreover, I don't think that people are really in a position to make that contribution. So for me, that's a sort of off limits as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so that's what I want to say about that topic. On Moore and diaphanousness and idealism, I mean, I didn't say this exactly, but I'm extremely sympathetic with what Moore says about idealism. That is, I think Moore is onto something very important, because Moore's point is fundamentally that psychological states should be thought of as relations between subjects and things that are not psychological. So that if you're in a psychological state, there is something non-psychological that you're related to. Exactly what that thing is an open question. Maybe it's a physical object, maybe it's a fact, maybe it's a property, maybe it's a set of possible worlds or something. But it's certainly not psychological. And so there's a sense in which a straightforward interpretation of idealism cannot be right before we even get to, other famous issues about idealism, because it just can't be true that everything is determined by the mental if the mental itself involves things that aren't mental. That's what I take Moore to be saying. And I'm very sympathetic with that, yes. Though, again, it's a sort of not my department as far as the project of this book goes. Okay, so that's why I don't say that, but that's what I would think underneath. On the illusionism argument, as you remember from the summer school, I like the illusionism. I like the Moorean argument against illusionism. I didn't use it here because it's not a sort of straightforward application of questions about introspection. I mean, it is in a way, because one of the premises by introspection. And I could have said, yeah, the rationalist account actually provides a defense of the illusionism, of that Moorean argument against illusionism, because it shows that the premise is not, it shows that the premise, which you would know by introspection, is such that given that you know it by introspection, you don't know it by inference from the conclusion, which means that you don't really get the point that it begs the question. So I could certainly have said that. I didn't say that there, I suppose, because I was thinking of applying what I was saying more directly to questions about introspection, which is why I mentioned illusionism. I did make a variant of that point when talking about the cogito, because the cogito, people say there are these famous objections to the cogito, namely that it begs the question, somewhat in the way that people think that the Moorean argument against the skeptic begs the question. And I did say in response to that argument that I think the rationalist account shows that it doesn't beg the question, because for the same reason, you can come to know the premise that you think, but not from inference from the conclusion that you exist, but just by introspection. And if that's true, then the cogito, whatever problems it has, it doesn't have the problem that it begs the question. So anyway, that's the reason why I didn't discuss it. And it's not at all because I've changed my mind. It's because I wasn't concerned with that particular issue at that point. Right, so on the illusionism argument, it's a good point you make that illusionists say that there are two notions of pain, the functional one and the phenomenal one. And that they might say that once we distinguish those notions, the phenomenal one it's just not true that no one is in phenomenal. They would accept that nobody is in phenomenal pain. They would say that we're in functional pain, but not phenomenal pain. That's right. Now, I know they would say that. I guess I'm very skeptical that they can provide an interpretation of the words functional and phenomenal there. It's a bit like, think of the famous Meinongian position, where Meinong says there are two notions. Suppose we've got, an object like Vulcan, the planet doesn't exist, and Meinong is worried by the problem that if Vulcan doesn't exist, then the sentence Vulcan doesn't exist is meaningless. But it isn't meaningless, it's in fact true. So what does exist means? And he says, well, we've got two notions of existence, exists and subsists, or if you like, existence sub one and existence sub two. And of course, we all agree, formally speaking, that you can solve this problem, whatever problem Meinong was dealing with, the problem of negative existentials, You can solve that by distinguishing existence sub 1 and existence sub 2, but the problem is that none of us know what those two notions of existence are. And so I think that's the problem with Meinong. It's that, formally speaking, yes, we can do philosophy by subscript, existence sub 1 and existence sub 2, and then say that we've solved the problem. But that doesn't really solve the problem because we can't interpret what the subscripts mean. I guess I think something similar is true here for the illusionist. While, of course, they say that there's some phenomenal notion and some functional notion, we don't know what that means, because if the functional notion isn't phenomenal, that sounds like it's pain that isn't a feeling. And nobody knows what that is. And if the phenomenal notion isn't functional, that means it's pain which doesn't do anything. And that nobody knows what that is either. It seems essential to pain that it does things. So that's why I would say that while I take your basic point that the illusionist will want to make this move, I guess I don't think myself that they will be able to do that because they won't have said what the relevant properties are.
I see, thank you.
Thank you, Evgeny. Thank you, Daniel. Anna Kostikova, Anna Anatolyevna, please.
Daniel, glad to see you, and
Yes, nice to see you too.
congratulations for your wonderful book. Really, much more history of ideas than in other contemporary analytical studies. So it's really a honey for my heart. So it's really important for the classical continental tradition, so-called. So in quotes. But really, I think that the crucial point of the book are the difference that you made on maybe on not on any, but on many page in each part of the book. And I think that we have in some view very closed questions to pose today, because in some way it's all about definitions and the understanding. So I'll try to maybe reformulate my preliminary questions and to make you introspect your book in some way. Maybe for me it was really the first four parts of your book, or when you put the definition of rationality, conscience, and so on, very important. And I have maybe the first approach, I have the impression that you propose a very ambitious project to make from a problem in philosophy the introspection, to make a start point for the philosophy. And it's the think that we have to maybe request from the point of view how do we deal from different tradition. On some cases, you precise that, for example, your project let Descartes and Hume go together to the question of existence, but on other I worry. So, for example, on consciousness, you write that you overcome the phenomenological point of view on conscience. What about psychologist and anti-psychologist approach? That was a very important moment for Husserl, for example. What if we overcome phenomenological approach and in any questions, pain or some other, could we say that it's also the result on the main definition of conscience, of introspection, and so on. Second question is also about the difference that we have in tradition to take the conscience or as a process or as a result. What is about your position? Is it the ruling of this capacity of introspection? Is it a process, or we have always a final result? And in this field, could maybe we come back to the first question about AI? Could we take your definitions at the same point as definition of AI? Maybe without cerebral conditions, but with this idea behind about the algorithmic process. Even when we have the results, we have the algorithmic process that could be recycled or something like this. And at least, but on the same context, could you add something to the list of problems that you announce in the book? Or it's a final version? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are terrific questions again. Let me just. Okay. So let's go. So the first question I think you had in mind was, what about different traditions of thinking about consciousness? For example, the Husserlian tradition. Where do I stand with respect to those? And then there was a question about whether the process involved, whether introspection should be thought of as a process or the outcome or the result of that process. Process or a product, something that you get to. Right. And then there's an issue about AI. And I take it you mean, were you suggesting that I was talking about 13 problems, and your suggestion is, hey, there's a 14th problem, namely AI. Yes. Well, let's begin with the first one. One thing I try to do, I don't know how well this came across, so I'd be interested to know your reactions. But one thing I was trying to do in the book is to say, okay, I accept this particular picture of introspection. And there are a lot of people in my own tradition who don't hold that view, and I'm trying to promote that particular picture. But having said that, I also think that there's lots of different versions of the introspective picture. And so to some extent, I want to invite the reader to think about other versions as well. Now, at certain points in the book, I say, okay, I'm going to defend it in this version. But there's another version that you could hold if you wanted to. And so in particular, if we're thinking about introspection, then introspection is in the first chapter, I just define it as a distinctive way that you come to know or believe that you are in a conscious state. Now, if you think of introspection that way, you obviously have to know what a conscious state is, because you've just defined introspection in terms of a conscious state. The question is, what is a conscious state? Now, in chapter 2, I offer a kind of account of what that is. But you're right to say that there are alternative accounts. And the Husserlian account might be an alternative one where, for example, I don't think Husserl would accept the kind of position I'm operating with, on which beliefs or judgments, perhaps in the way that Husserl might think of them, do not have a phenomenology. I'm sure he would think of them as having a phenomenology too. And so he wouldn't accept that particular move. And so he's not going to accept the rationalist account in the form I do. That seems right. But I would say that he could accept the entire structure, and he would just put in his own account of what a conscious state is, one which is actually broader than mine. He would think that beliefs and judgments and so on have their own phenomenology, where I'm not making that assumption. But mostly, most of the points I make are entirely consistent with that. And so if he wanted to make that assumption, that would be fine by me. It would be what I would regard that as a version of the proposal, which isn't quite the one that I advance, but it's close. It's quite close, and it isn't one of the alternative positions that I imagine. In the case of Husserl, I think Husserl probably didn't just think that judgments and beliefs and so on have a phenomenology. I think he would also think that something like an acquaintance principle is true. And so that part of it, Husserl, again, I would be kind of opposed to, because I don't see that form of argument. But once again, it's not because you couldn't be a rationalist if you did that. I just don't see the point of adding that particular bit. That seems like for me, that's a sort of an element that doesn't really do anything. So I don't really see why one should adopt it. But someone in the Husserlian tradition would presumably think of that as pretty much non-negotiable. Is absolutely important. And so I realize that, and those people could, from my point of view, those people could be brought into the tent. It's not too hard to imagine that. It's just not the version that I would adopt. So I'm at a certain abstract level, I'm more pluralist than you might imagine. So that's what I would say about those sorts of positions. On the process or result issue, yeah, I think introspection is a process. And at one point, I discussed the question of, so for me, it's quite important to distinguish psychological states and psychological processes. And psychological processes are things like inferences. Those are good examples of psychological processes. But there are other kinds of transitions from one state to another, which are also psychological processes. And those issues come up in those issues. Those things connect with the topic of introspection in a number of ways. One is, you might ask, can you know by introspection that you are undergoing a certain process? So that's one question I was interested in. Can you know by introspection that you have inferred this? You've inferred this conclusion from this premise, for example. Now, one question that you might ask is, can you know by introspection that you have come to believe this by introspection? Is introspection itself an object of introspection? And there I'm thinking of introspection as a process, just as you were suggesting. Of course, it is true that there's also a result, because the result is the belief that you end up with. It's the belief that you're in the state. That's the result of the process. And there are two issues. There's the process, and then there's the result. And you could ask both things about whether you know by introspection that these things happen, or whether you know in some other way. And I say in the book, well, I don't think we know by introspection that we go through a process of introspection. I don't think that's very plausible, because in order for that to be true, the process that you go through by introspection would have to be conscious, and that strikes me as not very plausible. That isn't to say that we don't know that we know things by introspection. Of course we do, but we just don't know it by introspection. Perhaps we know it by applying a theory to ourselves. That's roughly the suggestion of the book at that point. So yeah, so I think of it as a process mostly, but of course it does have an outcome, which is the belief. So in that sense, it's rather like an inference. It's not an inference, but it's rather like an inference, because an inference, it's a process from one belief to another, and the outcome of the process is another belief, is the belief that is the conclusion of the process. On AI, Yes, I mean, it is interesting to ask about. I mean, there are a lot of people these days who, discuss this question about, large language models and whether large language models can introspect and so forth. And I mean, I do think that's a question. It's not a puzzle exactly about introspection, except insofar as it presupposes a view about what introspection is. Partly because I think there's a much more general question, which is, can large language models think in general? Are they rational? If so, what do they think about? Like, do they think only about word tokens, or do they think about the world? Do they have world models? You know? Um, and all of those questions are quite interesting. I tend, as I mentioned before, I'm not at all persuaded myself that large language models have are really, artificial intelligence is really in our grasp. I think it's more likely that they're technologies that are kind of aids to thought. They help us think about things, but don't themselves think. I'm quite partial to that hypothesis. But so I do think it's an interesting topic. I I'm not sure it's a problem about introspection in quite the way that the other problems I dealt with. But I agree with you that there's something arbitrary about drawing the list at 13. I could have gone further and said 14 or 15. Maybe 13 is a nice number though, so that's why I stopped. But so I appreciate your proposal. In terms of where the book is, it is at the press at the moment. They haven't given me the proofs, so I will have time to adjust a few things. But I doubt very much they'd be pleased if I said, "Oh, there's another chapter on AI." I think they'd tell me, "Okay, that's for the next book."
Thank you so much. But we can say that in the 14th problem AI, it will be based on the capacity of introspection.
That's
It
right.
could be an
Yes, that's right.
example.
It could be an example. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Daniel. Anton Kuznetsov, please.
Yeah. Hi, Dan. Thank you very
Hi there.
much for your wonderful book, and it's well written. Like, of course, I'm a Russian-speaking person. I'm not able to evaluate how it sounds in English, but it looks like it's a well-written book, and it's I would say reader-friendly book in some way, of course, because in a sense it is a hardcore philosophy and analysis, and I spent several hours discussing your book with ChatGPT,
Uh-huh.
and what I understood after the discussion that actually um, you could find answers to almost all your questions in your book if you read it carefully. So the moral is that I should read your book more carefully as I read. I um, I would start from the refutation of illusionism. First of all, it's a great naming. Uh,
Thank you.
And I have kind of the same worry as Evgeny has. So, first of all, of course, if I am a friend of phenomenal consciousness, I would be happy to read the refutation of illusionism. It would be like a sweet song for me. But if I am an illusionist, I feel like that I would not find your argument persuasive, and as I see, you understand it, that for illusionists that sounds maybe not that persuasive. But also, I have some worries with consistency with the main, I would say, not motivation, but main approach of your book. So, in the beginning, you characterize consciousness as a cluster concept. And also, you are trying to avoid questions about the exact mechanisms, exact theory of introspection as a process. So it's not your area of interest in your book. But as far as I understand, illusionists, they exist in a different level. So they exist in a level of mechanisms, in a level of theory, and it seems they would say also would react in this manner that, look, we are fine with the cluster concept of consciousness. And if I'm an illusionist, I could take a cluster concept of consciousness and it would work well for me, except phenomenal character.
Yeah.
But if you criticize illusionism in your book, it seems you move from your kind of main approach to the exit position. So your position here is not a cluster concept of consciousness. Your position is like more strict position, and
Yeah.
it seems like a bit inconsistent with the main approach of your book. This is my worry, and also I have a worry, kind of empirical worry. Is it possible to have introspective beliefs without related conscious states? For example, there is, as you might know, of course, famous Anton Bambinsky syndrome, where people, in some cases, actually, in some cases, people lack visual capacities, visual consciousness, but still they produces introspective beliefs about vision. For example, they produces, oh, look, I see red qualia. And if it's true, then if we look at your free stage argument with F property, so it seems Anton Babinski syndrome satisfies these three stages. So we believe F, like red qualia, to be instantiated by introspection. But red qualia is not instantiated because of syndrome. And red qualia for sure plays a crucial role in the mind-body problem. So
Yeah, good.
kind of, yeah. So let's move on to other questions. Thank you to Artyom. He already asked questions about animals and AI. And I should emphasize that when you formulate rationality, it seems like only humans could be rational. I mean, you use this non-contradiction rule, modus ponens, and others, and examples which could be, from my point of view, applied only to humans. And in this sense, I have a worry in what sense animals could have some kind of rationality, because your notion of rationality looks not inclusive, as I might say.
Yeah.
And also, with rationality, I have this worry that, as you say, it is normative. It is about what I ought to do, and it seems to me that, in this sense, the introspection principle is not something I ought to do. Because if I'm a neurotypical human being, it's just impossible to not abide by the principle of introspection, it seems to me. So there is no something I ought to do, because if I ought to do something, it is a matter of choice. But I don't see
Okay.
that there is some kind of choice.
I see.
But still, it's it's from position of a reader of your book who is not familiar with the introspection, because rationality is quite a broad notion. Also, I thought about cluster concept of consciousness, and my question, why we don't treat other crucial notions, concepts of your book, like awareness, belief, knowledge, as cluster concepts. I mean, because these concepts are contested, so we could provide the same arguments to treat them as cluster concepts as for consciousness. And if it's an open possibility, if it's if it's an open possibility, does it does it is there a threat to your rationalist account of introspection? Because in this sense, it it would become too broad to explain something, I believe. So if acquaintance is a cluster concept, if knowledge is a cluster concept. So as a reader, I would love to see why I treat only consciousness as a cluster concept, but I do not treat other central notions as a cluster concept. Because if I do the last thing, maybe it would not kind of just destroy your position, but I see some threats here.
Yes.
And in general, your book and as your course 5 years ago provides great arguments against other positions, and but I have a worry. Doesn't rationalist account is kind of ad hoc account? I mean, okay, we have these problems, these other approaches do not solve these problems, but we could stipulate that it is a rational rule, and that's it. And for some philosophers and readers, it would sound like an ad hoc. But of course, you're discussing this in this option in your book, but still I have this question. So thank you. This is enough, but I have many other questions. But let's finish here.
Anton, those are terrific questions, and thanks so much for saying that it's reader friendly. I really appreciate your saying the book that's reader friendly. It's terrific. Okay, so just to summarize, the one issue is about my discussion of illusionism, and you asked, first of all, isn't that inconsistent with the cluster concept of consciousness idea? Or at least isn't there some tension there? And then also you asked about cases in which you believe that you see or that you have some sort of qualia or something, even though you don't. And doesn't that create a possibility for the property F that I was mentioning? The problem for illusionism is that there's no such property, and you've basically offered a candidate property. Okay, so that was one issue. Another issue is about animals, and you were focusing on modus ponens in particular, and you're thinking, look, animals cannot reason according to modus ponens, so aren't I at the end of the day operating with a notion of rationality that's restricted to humans and not to animals? The third question, I guess, or a set of questions was, as you say, I am claiming that we ought to do certain things, we ought to believe certain things, and you say that that's not very plausible because when you ought to do something, it's a matter of choice, and this is not a matter of choice, so it can't really be an ought claim. So that seems to be impossible. A fourth question, I guess, was about cluster concepts, and you said, hey, if you're allowed a cluster concept of consciousness, then why aren't you also allowed a cluster concept of acquaintance, belief, knowledge, or any other notion that I mentioned? And wouldn't that be a threat to the position and maybe undermine it? And then the final question is, isn't the account ad hoc? Because after all, you've just picked this rational principle out of thin air, and what justifies it being a principle or a principle of rationality? And, you know, that's just, sure, if that were true, then maybe the whole thing follows, but why should we accept that it is a principle? And as you say, I did discuss that objection, but maybe not sufficiently. So those, I take it, those are the main points you mentioned. Okay, so let's go through it. On the refutation of illusionism, it's true, of course, that what I say about the cluster concept is that there are various, once you've got the notion of a cluster concept, then what is true is that you can adopt more restricted or less restricted concepts for a particular theoretical purpose or in a particular theoretical context. And so what I say is that when we're thinking about introspection, the very inclusive notion is very plausible, because otherwise we end up requiring that, for example, any introspective state has phenomenal character. And I don't want to make that assumption, not because I have, you know, not because I have a long argument about it in the book, but simply I regard it as like overly speculative to rely on. I need a theory of introspection that would apply to beliefs, even if they lack phenomenal character. But of course, it is true that for many states with phenomenal character, we can introspect them. And so a way to deal with that is using the inclusive notion that I mentioned, the cluster notion. But that doesn't mean that in lots of other contexts we use more restricted notions. And I think that in the context of the mind-body issue, we generally use a more restricted notion. Mainly, we use the notion in which it's necessary that a state has phenomenal character. That's the thing, because it's phenomenal character that's the thing that generates the mind-body issue, not so much the other notions. And so when you're talking about that, when we use the word conscious or conscious state or words of that kind in the context of the mind-body problem, phenomenal character is really the property that we're interested in. And so that's the one that I'm interested. That's why I'm and of course illusionists are interested in the mind-body issue, so that's the notion that they have in mind, and we know independently that that's the notion that they have in mind. So I guess I feel that I do operate with a cluster notion when I'm talking about introspection mostly, but when you're talking about introspection plus the mind-body problem, because it's the mind-body problem, it has to be a phenomenal character notion. So that's why, that's the interaction between those things. On the idea of Anton syndrome and all that sort of stuff, where you can believe that you're in a conscious state even though you're not, I think that's perfectly possible. And I wouldn't want to say that. One thing that's true, of course, is that the illusionists aren't saying that there are people who can have introspective illusions. That's not simply what they're saying. They want to say it's somehow endemic to us, or a feature of our a sort of more or less standing feature of our mental lives, and that it's not the case. And for any conscious state you like, at least any one that raises the mind-body problem, this has to be true. So it's not quite the same as Anton syndrome, where it's just that certain people and certain conscious states are such that those people can believe that they're in conscious states even though they're not. The view about rationality and introspection that I like permits that as a possibility, but it doesn't think of as that possibility as the one that the illusionists are talking about. They're talking about a much more general kind of illusion, if you like, than that. And so that's what I would say. So it's not, I think that isn't quite an example of the property of being F in the sense that I have in mind. Not because it isn't an example of the property of being F, but remember, it's the illusionist says something like, there is a property F such that the following thing is true. We believe by introspection that F is instantiated, F is not instantiated, and F is central to the mind-body problem. For the point about Anton syndrome, I think the crucial question is, who is the we? that's at issue. And I think what the illusionist has in mind is something like we agents in general, not just particular agents like those that are suffering Anton syndrome, but all of us are in that position. That's what the illusionist wants to say. So I think while I don't want to, I think the approach to introspection that I have in mind permits the possibility of the person who's suffering Anton syndrome, as it should, because those are possible. It doesn't quite interact with illusionism in the way that I had in mind. That's what I want to say about that. Let's say something about animals and modus ponens. You may be right, I don't know exactly, that it depends on complicated matters of animal cognition and what animals are really like and so forth. But you may be right that they don't accept modus ponens forms of reasoning. Entirely sure that that's true, but suppose that is true. That wouldn't by itself mean that the notion of rationality that I have in mind doesn't apply to them, because this is sort of similar to some of the points that have come up before. To be rational means for there to be a bunch of rational principles that you abide by. Now, you don't have to abide by all of them to be rational, and you don't have to abide by them all the time to be rational. So that, for example, it could be that animals, I'm not saying that this is true, but suppose it were true that they didn't abide by the modus ponens principle. Still, it's true that animals coordinate beliefs and perceptions, for example. They're more likely to coordinate belief and perception than we are, I would have thought. Still, it's true that animals don't have contradictory beliefs. They somehow or other, if they believe something, and then they believe that the food is over here, and then they realize it's not over here, then the belief that the food is over there somehow dissipates. It somehow goes out of their mind. We don't exactly know the mechanism whereby that happens, but it seems to happen. And so the animals actually abide by a no contradiction principle. Now, do they abide by a modus ponens principle? It's complicated. It's got to do with whether they have, for example, conditional beliefs. That's a difficult question in animal cognition. Maybe they don't, in which case they don't abide by modus ponens, but not for a complicated reason. I think it's simply because they're not capable of forming conditional beliefs. And that's probably the same reason they don't abide by the introspection principle, because they may not be capable of even forming metacognitive beliefs. Again, that depends on complicated questions about animal cognition. So I think that the notion of rationality that I have in mind is applicable to animals, actually. I mean, I do agree that it sometimes comes across as if it isn't, because for example, I'm thinking, well, to be rational is to abide by these principles, and I'm speaking as if the principles are these kind of abstract objects that you have to abide by, and how can that be true for, your cat or your dog or something? And that might be right. I mean, of course, as I say, you can also put it in terms of rational dispositions, if you like. A lot of people like that because it sounds less intellectual. For me, as I say, I don't really mind. I'm happy to go back and forth between that. But generally speaking, I tend to think of, animals as rational as well, even if it's true that there are some rules, perhaps a modus ponens rule or perhaps an introspection rule that they don't abide by. What about the interesting question about ought and choice? So you're saying that you can only have a norm if it's something that you can choose to do. I guess, to be honest with you, I'm committed to the negation of that claim, because I think you're right that I don't think we sort of choose to believe whether you're in a conscious state or not. You are, but nevertheless you ought to. And now, is that bad? Well, I guess I would say that, suppose that in general, I mean, this is related to the issue about voluntarism, about belief, like whether you can choose to believe things or not. Some people think you can't choose to believe things at all. Belief is just something that happens to you. You can choose to do things such that it's plausible that you'll come to believe them, but you can't choose to believe them. It's like when people talk about Pascal's wager kind of thing. You can't choose to believe in God, but you can choose to go to church or something for many years, and then maybe belief in God will just happen to you. But you still haven't chosen to believe in God. Now, suppose that that's true about belief. I'm not claiming that that's true, but a lot of people believe that that's true, so that a certain kind of anti-voluntarist position is true for belief. If that's true, then we can't have any ought claims at all about belief, given your principle connecting ought and choice. And I guess I find that that's not that plausible. So I guess I would say that we can say that you ought to believe certain things. I mean, take modus ponens. Maybe you're right that animals don't abide by modus ponens, but we certainly abide by modus ponens. And if I believe P and believe P, if P then Q, then it may be true that I ought to believe that Q, but still whether I do believe that Q, that's not a matter of choice, since voluntarism in general might be true about might be false. I'm sorry about belief. So I guess you're right, and this is a very acute point, that I'm committed to the falsity of this claim. And I think you're right about that. And actually, I hadn't really focused on that before. So excellent. That's an excellent point. But on reflection, I guess I feel it's not so bad to be committed to the falsity of that, because maybe we're committed to the falsity of that anyway. I mean, there's this general problem about beliefs, which is that we treat people as if they're responsible for their beliefs. Just like we think of they're responsible for their actions, even though they didn't choose to believe things. At least they didn't choose to believe things if a kind of anti-voluntarist position is true. Unless there's something deeply incoherent about that, I feel I'm okay. Cluster concepts. You're quite right again, actually, that you could think of belief as a cluster concept too. I mean, for example, sometimes belief is used in such a way that you don't believe something unless you have a way to formulate it in language, in natural language. And sometimes we talk about beliefs in such a way that that isn't the case. And so you might say, wow, maybe this is an element in our concept of belief that is like a cluster, is like an element in a cluster concept. So it just isn't required. There's concepts of belief such that that's required, and then there are other concepts of belief such that that isn't required. And maybe for knowledge, I mean, if that's true for belief, it's probably true for knowledge. And maybe awareness is similar, or at least it could be thought of as a cluster concept. So I agree with you in general on the logical point that, if you're going to play the cluster concept card with respect to consciousness, maybe you can play it with respect to all the others as well. I agree with that. I'm not quite seeing that that threatens anything, though. That would need to be shown. I mean, you'd need to show that, there is, take belief, since you're right to say, maybe a nice way to make your point is the following. I say, there's an introspection principle that says, setting aside some complications, if you're in a conscious state, believe that you're in it. And then I say, hey, what does conscious state mean? And I give a kind of cluster account of that. And a way to make your point, Anton, is I could have said, hey, what does belief mean? And give a cluster account of that too. And then I would have ended up with lots of different ones. And that's true. I agree with that in principle. I didn't really discuss that. I guess it's not obvious to me that that would create some problem. That would need to be shown. In principle, yes, it could, but not so clear. Ad hoc. I guess so. You're clearly unmoved by what I said about that objection. Let me just repeat what I said about that objection and see what you think. I mean, so one thing I say is, maybe I didn't say this explicitly, but when you ask, like, take the modus ponens principle, there's a sort of sense in which, or the no contradiction principle, or the principle that says that we should coordinate beliefs and perceptions. Many of us kind of more or less accept that those are rational principles, even though, of course, it's controversial as to how exactly to spell them out and something like that. It's a bit hard to think that we've got any notion of rationality which doesn't require that, at least theoretical rationality. But you could still ask the question, why are they rational principles? Why are we so sure that, like, the no contradiction principle is a rational principle? And I think one of the answers is something like, well, we've got certain cases that make it plausible that it's a rational principle, at least intuitively seems that way. And so it's a sort of a plausible hypothesis given those cases. And another thing would be that it, and so I think something similar is true in the introspection case. Like, for example, take the judgment that Shoemaker is interested in, which he calls the impossibility of self-blindness, which is supposed to be a datum. It's like, if you're in, you have an extreme pain in your foot, you're really interested in whether you have an extreme pain in your foot. You're perfectly capable of believing that you have an extreme pain in your foot. You have no evidence against the hypothesis that you have an extreme pain in your foot. What should you believe in that context? And Shoemaker's claim is, you should believe that you have an extreme pain in your foot. Now, the question is, that's supposed to be a datum. What explains that datum? Well, one thing that explains it is you're a rational agent, and if you're rational, you have to abide by a certain principle. What are the principles? The principles must at least entail the introspection principle. So that's a kind of an argument that the introspection principle is a principle of rationality. Again, maybe put that again. If you have a pain in your foot and all of these background conditions obtain and you're rational, what should you believe? Answer, that you have a pain in your foot. Ask yourself the question, what is it to be rational such that that is true? It must be that you abide by some principles that entail this. Those principles must entail the introspection principle. So that's why the introspection principle is a principle of rationality. So that's a way of arguing for the principle of introspection as a principle of rationality that's very like the standard forms of argument. That is, you begin with some very basic intuitions and you say that the principle of rationality, that the relevant principle of rationality accommodates those intuitions. So that's the kind of line of argument I want to undertake. And of course, I have this other argument, which is the burden of the entire book, which is, well, notice also that if we think that it is a principle of rationality, look what we can do with this principle. Looks like you can just go through the problems and solve them. And that by itself seems to me to be a good argument, that just inference to the best explanation, on the assumption that this thing is a principle of rationality, we can just solve these problems one after the other, and otherwise we can't do it. So that's a very good argument that it is a principle of rationality. So that's my answer to the question about whether it's ad hoc. It is true, I agree with you initially, it looks ad hoc because it looks like you're just adding stuff to solve a problem. But I think that on reflection, that isn't true. And actually, any principle of rationality can be made to look weird in that way. So that's why I am.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniel. It seems we are in need to have another summer school.
Oh, pleasure. Yeah, well, maybe that's a good idea.
Thank you very much, Anton. Thank you, Daniel. Artem, Yashin, please.
Greetings, Daniel. Thank you for the
Hello.
book. It was nice to engage with these topics after 2020.
Yeah.
And I've got a couple of questions. The first one is about proximal intentions. So how does your account accommodate proximal intentions? Because some might say they have a special built-in epistemic character. And, well, I mean, intentions in action, like the kind of intention which is not deliberative, but which guides behavior in a more direct way. There could be a necessary connection between this state and introspective belief if we accept something like practical knowledge, among these lines. What do you think about these? Because you talk about inference, about belief, about perception, etc., but not this kind of agentive stuff, which is more direct and not like deliberative. And the second question is about cognitive phenomenologists. What exactly goes awry in their heads when they discover cognitive phenomenology, the phenomenology of conscious thought? They claim to find phenomenal character in beliefs, for example, and what's faulty in their account? So where are they mistaken? Do they apply revelation wrong, or what's at issue? So I'm just curious.
Yeah, those are great questions. So by proximate intention, you mean, just say a bit more about what that is?
Proximal intention, yeah, it's
Proximal
versus distal intentions.
Yes.
There are or prior intentions and intentions in action. In Searle's
So what's
account,
an example of such an intention? What's an example of
so
such an intention?
if I raise my hand, there is an intention in my action, so which guides my raising my hand. So I may intend to do that or plan to do that as a prior intention, but when I actually do it, when I get up from the sofa, for example, or just get up in general, I have this intention which actually, has this putative causal efficacy, as one might say.
I see. I see. Yes. So I think there are two. I don't discuss that explicitly. You're quite right. There are two issues there. I think one is, does the account apply to intentions?
Yes, how does it
And
accommodate this kind of
yes.
intentions?
And another one might be, it kind of in the background is, does the account apply to actions?
Yeah,
Because actions are, you might have thought, actions face the same kind of issue. That is, how do I know that I'm raising my arm or raising my hand? That's an action I undergo. And on the face of it, it looks as if I don't know this by perception. I don't know it by inference. It's not the same way that I know that you might be raising your hand, for example. So there's that issue as well. So there's sort of two issues. One is about how does the account apply to intentions, and the other is how does it apply to actions. On intentions, I want to say that intentions can be conscious in the relevant sense, just like beliefs can. And even intentions that have direct causal efficacy of the kind that you mentioned, rather than planning in advance, they can be conscious. So they can be conscious in the sense that they can have a wide functional role, they can be poised in the relevant sense, they may even have a phenomenal character, and so forth. You can attend to the content of the intention. So that in one of the reasons I quite like this account is that it has a sort of generality built in. It would apply to any kind of conscious state or process as long as it's conscious. And so if intentions are conscious, then we could come to know by introspection that we have them, even in the case in which they have the particular causal role that you mentioned. So that's what I would want to say about that. In the case of actions, it's a little different. I think actions are in the chapter on inference. I said, well, there's a problem about inference, which is that they don't seem to be conscious in any of the relevant senses that we've isolated. They perhaps are not phenomenally conscious. Inferences are transitions from one kind of state to another kind of state, rather than being themselves a kind of state. And those transitions don't seem to be conscious in the relevant sense. They're not access conscious in the way that I was emphasizing, because they don't themselves have intentionality. And perhaps they're not phenomenally conscious. So that's a controversial assumption, but it's an assumption that people seem to be sympathetic to, and I certainly operate in the book as if that's true. And so you need some alternative account about why you might know, in the case that you do, that you've performed a certain inference. And what I say is that a certain kind of limited higher order theory applies in these cases. So inferences are conscious because you're conscious of performing them. That's the sense in which they are conscious. And that's a very different sense of consciousness than that applies to states like beliefs or perceptions, and also would apply to states like intentions. Intentions are states like beliefs are, or sensations are, and so I tend to apply the same view to them as I would do as to beliefs and perceptions. But inferences are not like that, because they don't seem to be conscious in the relevant kind of way. I sort of say in a footnote that I think the same thing is true for actions. So I think actions are conscious insofar as you're conscious of doing them. And that's the sense in which actions are conscious. So when you raise your arm, you can come to know that you raise your arm by introspection, or at least by a process that's very much like introspection. There might be a kind of technical sense in which it isn't introspection because it's not exactly a conscious state. But you might think, yes, it is a kind of conscious state because you're conscious of being in it or conscious of undergoing it, a conscious process. And if so, you can come to know by introspection that you're in it. So I would want to, so to summarize, I would say that when you ask me about intentions, there's two kinds of issues that basically, there's one kind of issue which is, can you come to know by introspection that you intend something, even in cases in which your intention is producing the thing that you intend? Yes, I think the answer is yes, at least in principle, as long as the intention is conscious, which it may well be, because it's a state like belief or like sensation, and those things can be conscious in the sense that I had in mind. If you mean an action, then I think the story is a little bit different, because I think actions are conscious in a different way. They're conscious because you're conscious of performing them. But if you're conscious of performing them, then you can come to know by introspection that you're in them. Notice that when I say that you're conscious of performing them, I don't mean to imply that you know by introspection that you're performing them. I mean something else. I mean that they are the target of a certain kind of awareness and attention. And of course they will be under certain cases, because they will be the consequence of your having an intention. That's what an action will be. And so that I think a certain kind of higher order theory will apply. So that's what I want to say about the intention case, but I certainly didn't draw the proximate distal distinction that you just did and think about intention in that way at all. But I would say in general that attention, same kind of story applies to intention. In the case of action, a slightly different story applies, the one that a variant on the proposal that I made about inference. On cognitive phenomenology, what's gone wrong? I mean, it's in principle possible, by the way, that nothing has gone wrong, and that what we've got here is there are different kinds of minds. You know, there are some minds for whom beliefs feel a certain way, and there are other minds for whom beliefs don't feel a certain way. That's a sort of possibility. Still, I don't want to rule that out. It could be that when Uriah Kriegel or somebody says that there's such a thing as cognitive phenomenology, it may be true for Uriah's mind, but it may not be true for somebody else's mind who denies it. That's a kind of possibility. My attitude is only that we don't want a theory of introspection that requires us to have minds that conform to, that are exactly like Uriah's mind, because that probably isn't true for most of us. I mean, that may not be the only thing that's gone wrong. It could also be that when you look at the actual cases, what's often true is that there's an associated phenomenology, which is, there's an associated sensory or attentional phenomenology or something that is being mistaken for a case of cognitive phenomenology. I tend to think that's true. Like, think of Galen Strawson's famous case of the difference between hearing a sentence in a language you understand and hearing a sentence in a language you don't understand. And he says there's a phenomenological difference between the two, and therefore there's something called understanding phenomenology that goes together with understanding. If you hear a sentence in a language you understand, there's a certain kind of phenomenology, and if you hear a sentence in a language you don't understand, it's different. That strikes me as much too quick, because while it is true that there's a phenomenal difference between those two cases, there are so many differences that it's unclear at all that it's a case of understanding phenomenology. For example, when you hear a sentence in a language you understand, you can segment the sound pattern of the sentence in quite a different way. You know where the syllables fall, you know where the word breaks are, and so forth. And that's just totally different in a language you really don't understand. You can't even do that. So you can attend in many different ways. The whole kind of auditory phenomenology is quite different. But that's not clear to me that that's a kind of understanding phenomenology in the sense that Strawson has in mind. So that's another possibility, that they're just overgeneralizing from cases where there's a perceptual difference to cases in which there is apparently a cognitive difference. But, I don't want to be too heavy about it. I'm not making the claim in the book, certainly, that that's a mistake. What I'm doing instead is saying that what Kriegel calls mainstream stinginess is a kind of methodological assumption, but it's no more than that, because it makes it harder, actually, if it's true, because you want a theory of introspection that will deal with introspection of belief or intention, for example, if they don't really have phenomenal character. But if they do have phenomenal character, nothing much would change. It's just you still deal with it in the same kind of way. So that's, I guess, what I want to say about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Artyom. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, it's my turn to ask the question. I will take the word. Daniel, thank you very much. I think it's a brilliant book, and it will be much more brilliant, well, when it will go out from the publisher. I'm waiting for it. I think that would be the book that I will read for the next 3 years, because me and my colleagues, we have common study of introspection and phenomenal consciousness right now. My part concerns introspection, so I think it would be just a table book for me. Thank you for such a great present. For me, it is very important. Thank you. I have lots of questions, but I think I will mention only 3 of them. The first one is a clarification question. Maybe it is just about the manner of expression, but I'm not sure. You're confronting Gilbert Ryle in many important respects. According to Ryle's position, introspection, as you define it, simply does not exist. And you're proving that it does exist, and it is a valuable source of our knowledge about our own conscious mental states. But I'm not sure that you should be opposed to Ryle when he says, and here I'm quoting page 138 of his concept of mind, when he says that when a person hums as he walks, he is doing 2 things at once. But when we speak of a person minding that he is saying or what he is whistling, we are not saying that he is doing 2 things at once. It may be helpful to remember that it is quite idiomatic to replace the heed verb by a heed adverb, like in reading attentively or driving carefully. What has been described is one operation with a special character, not 2 operations. And the same he points precisely about conscious. It is not supposed that when I am wondering, say, what is the answer to a puzzle, and I'm ipso facto consciously doing so, that I'm synchronically performing 2 acts of attention. One to the puzzle and the other to my wondering about it. It is from the page 158. But when you are talking about conscious on the page 23 of the manuscript, you also turn to its adverb form, saying that the use of conscious as it applies to states is closely related to its use as an adverb, as in consciously, and you clarified saying that to perceive something consciously is just to be in a conscious state of perceiving. Hence, if we know what property of a state of perception has when it consciousness, we will be able to say that the state of perceiving something consciously is. It seems for me that what you are talking here is that to be conscious is just a property of a mental state and not a separate act. In Ryle's term, what is being described here is one operation with a special character and not 2 operations. But still you claim on the same page 23 that it is one thing to, for example, perceive something, and it is another thing to do it consciously. And here adverb qualifies what is being done. And I'm not sure, is it just a manner of speech? Are you agree with Ryle indeed or not? If you are contradict with Ryle here, I don't understand why you should contradict Ryle here. You know, there are some problems if we assume the duplication here. Maybe you agree with Ryle, but it is just not the best wording. Can you please clarify it? For me, that is my first question. And the second question, I'm not sure I can formulate it quite good and correctly because Anton has already asked this question. It was the last question of Anton about ad hoc, but I would like to elaborate it a bit because I think it is the central question and the central problem of the whole book. Okay, for example, let's take Dretske's argument. Dretsky asks, he says, we know we're in conscious state, but how do we know it? He asks, there are no evidence introspection can provide us with. And you, as I understand, agree with Dretsky on this point. There are no evidence, but you say, and that is, I think, what your answer can be summarized, how it can be summarized. You say, we have no evidence, but there is a rule. A rule that if you are in the state S, then believe you are in the state S. And I'm a bit concerned whether it is a good explanation scheme at all, because whether it can in principle lead us to the answer we want to achieve. We can try to apply the same scheme to any other subject. Why is this plant growing? Why is your cat purring? Why am I hungry, for example, etc. And if the answer is there is a rule, it seems that it tells us nothing substantive about our problem, if that is the only our answer. As you know, this amazing phrase by Dretsky from his paper, we cannot do epistemology by stamping our feet. And alas, it seems that just claiming that there is a rule, we're just stamping our feet that there is something why and how we can know that we are in some conscious state. Of course, you say a lot more about this rule, what is it, its nature, it is rational, etc. But I'm not sure that I can believe you in all the respect you mentioned. Because, well, for example, right now, answering Anton, you said that this rule is the same kind as modus ponens, as I understand you. It is the same rational principle as modus ponens. But it seems to me that we can abide modus ponens, of course, but we can not to abide it. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we make these mistakes intentionally. Some people are very good in logic. Other people are not so good. One people abide it more carefully, other are not, etc. But it seems that in case of introspection principle, we cannot not to abide it. We cannot say, well, that is principle I don't want to use. And if that is the case, then just to claim that there is such kind of principle seems to be something trivial. If we cannot act otherwise, if that is how we act every time, just to claim that we do so cannot explain us why. It seems to me cannot why we do so. Compare it with the laws of nature. You discussing Dretsky's argument, you say that, well, we have no evidence, but we are warranted to believe that we are in some conscious state. And to have warrant to believe something is to be in a state that makes it appropriate for you to believe that thing. And also, this state should be available for you. And you define this availability like psychological state is available for you precisely because it is conscious and because you abide by a rational principle according to which if you are in this conscious state, you should believe that you are in it, other things being equal, etc. But I cannot see precisely how this availability differs from the availability for us to be in the state of being in a world that has such and such complete description, if physicalism is right. You said that is not availability of the right kind. We don't know what this description of the whole world is. We don't know the laws of nature that can help us to derive from this description the mental states we're in, etc. But what is the difference with the introspection principle here? Can we say that we truly know what this principle consists in? It seems that you agree in the first chapter that this principle can have lots of formulations. We can express it in different terms, and that there could be not only one, but the whole bunch of such principles, etc. And in answering Anton, you said that we can treat animals like rational agents, since we can say they abide some rational principle. But it doesn't seem that animals uh, have that these principles are available to animals in the relevant kind, and so that the relevant state of consciousness from which they have the relevant kind of availability is also available, etc. That they can be warranted in their belief that they are in some state. It seems that animals cannot know these principles of rationality in much the same way they cannot know the laws of nature. But why are we not in the same position? We cannot know the whole bunch of the laws of nature that will help us to derive it from the complete description of the world that we're in some particular mental state. But what is the source of our knowledge of the principle that you are describing, of the rational principle according to which, if we are in conscious state, just believe you are in it? Why this precise formulation, not something else with other details, etc.? And the final, last question. I do remember you have explained it to us on the summer school and helped you very much, but I just forgot. I forgot what does it mean to dance as an accountant? Can you explain it, please? Thank you.
Yes, excellent. Terrific questions. So let's go back to the first one about Ryle. And by the way, thanks again for those extremely kind words about the nature of the book and how interesting you found it. So I really appreciate those points. On the Ryle one, yes, Ryle wants to say that to do something consciously, I take it he wants to say that consciously is an adverb, and so it's a bit like driving slowly. When you drive slowly, there's not like there are two things that happen. There's a driving event and then something that's slow. It's that there's a single event done in a particular way. And so that's what he wants to say when he says there aren't two operations, there's just one. It's just that it's done in a particular way. And he wants to say the same thing about consciously. So if you perceive something consciously, it's not like you perceive it and then there's another thing that you do. It's just that the perceiving is done in a particular way. And to that extent, I kind of agree with Ryle, as you rightly point out. That is, I think that to perceive something and to perceive it consciously, what you're doing when you say consciously is that you're qualifying the perceiving in a certain kind of way. You're not saying there's another operation, or what he would call another operation. You're saying that you're saying that the perception happens in some sort of distinctive way. It can happen non-consciously, but it can also happen consciously. Now, so to that extent, I agree with Ryle. I doubt that Ryle would go on to say that the thing that I said in the paragraph that you mentioned, which is that for me, to perceive something consciously is to be in a conscious state, is to be in a state which is conscious. So to perceive consciously is to be in a state which is conscious. So when you say the second thing, you've got this thing called a state, and you're saying that that state has a certain property which we call conscious. I very much doubt that Ryle would express himself in that way, but he might, and actually, for my purposes, those things are equivalent. So when you perceive consciously, that just is to be in a state of perception which is conscious. There's nothing more nor less to those things. So, but I doubt he would say it that way, but I'm perfectly happy to say it that way. And so I would agree with Ryle when he's talking about the adverbial formulation of these ideas. Perhaps not when I doubt he would agree with the state type formulations where you have a state which is a property of, and then a property of the state. So to that extent, I agree with Ryle. Now I take it that what you had in mind is, aren't you agreeing with Ryle, but in other parts of the book you disagree with Ryle? I take it, is that the line of thought you had in mind? So when I talk about consciousness, there are certain comments which are similar to what Ryle had in mind.
No,
But
my
in other
question
parts of the
was
book,
just about one point on the 23rd,
I
23rd
see. So
page,
yeah, so I think
when you
there's
say that
fine.
there is one thing to perceive something and another thing that could be read like second thing to perceive it consciously.
Oh, I see.
That is my whole question first.
I see. Well, I think when Ryle is using the word, there's one thing, like in the case of you could say something like this: it's one thing to drive, it's another thing to drive slowly. That strikes me as a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And suppose you get caught for speeding by the police. They might say to you, say, well, I was just driving, to the shop to pick up some groceries. What's the problem? You might say. All I'm doing is driving to the shop. And they might say, no, but you're driving over the speed limit. You're driving very, very fast. And you can't say, well, there aren't two things. There's only one thing, driving. And driving fast is just driving. So why did you hold me up? And they would say, well, it's one thing to drive to the shop to get your groceries. It's another thing to drive fast. You drive fast, you might get a fine. That seems true. And Ryle can't be denying that. So there's a sense in which it's one thing to drive and another thing to drive fast. Likewise, it's one thing to perceive and another thing to perceive consciously. Now, I know what Ryle was objecting to a certain kind of philosophical picture, which he thought wasn't in ordinary thought, at least not in ordinary thought as expressed in language and in ordinary natural language. And the picture is that when you perceive something consciously, you perceive it, and then you perceive your perceiving of it in addition. Like there are two episodes of perception. That's what he wanted to say isn't the case. And he also wanted to say that when we ordinarily speak, we don't think it's the case. So in the background is this idea that philosophers have mistakenly interpreted our ordinary ways of speaking. And yeah, I'm quite happy to agree with Ryle on those points. Otherwise, I mean, Ryle often his points are quite accurate about the way we speak, and quite accurate about cautioning us to not overinterpret the way that we speak. I basically think Ryle is right about that. But for example, inferring from that introspection is a matter of inference, which is where Ryle seems to end up, seems to me to be quite mistaken. But Yeah, okay. If you're only talking about what I said on page 23, then yeah, I agree with Ryle. Sorry, that was a rather long-winded answer. Dancing like an accountant, I will leave up to your imagination. But the main issue is the ad hoc thing, which you said various things. One thing actually I think I realized I perhaps have been a bit misleading on is like when you said modus ponens, some people are good at logic and some people aren't good at logic. And I take it you meant that the introspection principle is not at all like that. That's of course true. Though by modus ponens in this context, I don't mean the logical principle. I mean a principle of rationality that says if you believe that P, and if you believe that if P then Q, then you ought to believe Q. So that's a principle that tells you about how to structure your beliefs. It's not a principle that says, you know, P and P, if P then Q entails Q. That's true. That's a principle about the entailment relations between certain propositions. But in this context, the modus ponens principle is a principle about how you ought to, what combinations of beliefs you ought to have. And so in that sense, the modus ponens principle is very analogous to the introspection principle, because the introspection principle is also not a principle of logic. It's a principle about what you ought to believe, given what kind of mental states you're in. And that's actually true for the modus ponens principle as well. And notice that the modus ponens principle, if we abide by it, it's not like some people are good at abiding by it and some people aren't, or something like that. It's supposed to be a principle that pretty much we're going to abide by. I mean, there may be cases where we fail to, I grant you, but there may be cases where we fail to abide by the introspection principle too. So it's insofar as you're a rational agent, you will basically abide by it. Your beliefs will be organized in this way. And we who are ordinary agents, I'm not making the claim that it's kind of essential to us that we're rational, but I do think it's an empirically plausible claim that we basically approximate rationality, and especially if we don't understand rationality in an incredibly idealized way, then it's plausible that we're rational. But that just means that we organize our minds in this relevant kind of way, and moreover, we do so because we abide by the principle. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So it's not, I don't think it's undermined by pointing out that, you know, that it's not like a modus ponens principle, because that's a principle of logic, and some people are good at logic and some people aren't. It's not, that isn't the notion of a modus ponens. I agree with you that there is a principle of logic called modus ponens, and some people are good at following it and some people aren't. Of course, I agree with that. But the notion of a modus ponens principle isn't that. It's a, yes, that may be slightly misleading actually in the way that I present things, but what I have in mind is the idea that there are principles of rationality. In other words, principles about what combinations of mental states rational agents are in. And generally speaking, we are in those combinations of mental states because we abide by the rules. So that's the notion I had in mind. You were saying in relation to Dretske that we can't do epistemology by stamping our feet. Dretske does say that. It's a little unclear what he means. I think what he means is that you can't say in response to the question, well, how do you know that you're in pain, that you are in pain? That is not a good response to the question. And I think he's right about that. That would be stamping your feet in the context. It's just pounding the table, saying, but I am in pain, damn it. And I think Dretske's right to say that that's not a good answer to the question. How do you know that you are in pain? That I am in pain. That's not a good answer. You know, Wittgenstein thought that question wasn't even a well-formed question. So Dretske thinks it's a well-formed question, but you can't answer it by saying, by pounding the table and saying that you are in pain. That's what he means by you can't do epistemology by stamping your feet. And I kind of agree with that. I think the answer to the question, how do you know that you're not in how do you know that you're in pain, or why do you believe that you're in pain, can't be the mere fact that you're in pain. That's not a good answer. But the fact that you're in pain and you abide by the rule That strikes me as a pretty good answer to that question. Why do I think that? Well, the point that Alex Byrne makes, which is that Dretski's problem is analogous to the problem of the external world. That's why he calls it skepticism about the internal world. And what Alex says is that in that problem, as Alex says, we have a kind of answer to that question, actually. And the question is, we know that there is an object, we know that the external world exists because we perceive it. But it's not that perceiving it provides us evidence in Dretski's sense. It's simply that the perceiving of it gives us warrant. Now notice that Dretski would say the same thing. You can't say, why is there a cup on the table? How do I know that there's a cup in front of me? Because I perceive it. That would be epistemology by stamping your feet, which Dretski doesn't like. But if it's, well, I perceive the cup and I abide by a principle that says, if I'm rational, I will accept the testimony of my senses, which I think that is a principle too, then I think we've got an answer to the problem about the external world. And I think that the problem about the internal world, as Alex calls it, can be answered in the same kind of way. And so I don't quite see it as the same as the stamping your feet phenomenon that Dretski was objecting to. Now, you may well be right, by the way, that Dretski wouldn't like this particular proposal. And I think probably you're right, he wouldn't. But I think he's not entitled to object to it on the grounds that it's stamping your feet, because it's not stamping your feet. It's saying that this thing has to be in place. And, it's an open question whether it's in place. But moreover, it's something that we would say in ordinary perceptual cases too. So I think Dretski thought that the problem about knowledge of our own minds was even more difficult than problems about knowledge of objects in our environment. And that doesn't seem to be true, because actually we would answer them in the same kind of way. In both cases, we have warrant but not evidence for the belief. And in both cases, we accommodate this by appealing to certain kinds of psychological states that we're in, plus certain kinds of rational principles. So in that sense, I think it's the same. Now, at one point you said something like, well, what about this notion of availability? And I agree that that's a kind of a curious notion. And I guess you were worried about two things. One is it true that the principles are available to us? And the other question was, why couldn't we apply it to cases? Why couldn't there just be a rule that says, if you're in a world in which the physical laws are as such, are thus and so, and the physical situation is thus and so, why shouldn't you believe that? Why can't you apply it to that case? And I guess I think on the first point about availability, I'm not making the claim that the principles are available to us. At least I'm not making that claim. I'm not saying that. I do think we have to abide by the principles, which means we have to perhaps represent the principles. But in that sense, it's a bit like representing the syntactic rules of the language that you speak. I don't think it's anything more than that. I don't think it's conscious that you do this or anything of that kind. I think you abide by the principles just as you abide by the principles of your language. So it's only in that sense that you know them. Are the principles available in the relevant sense? No, it's the conscious state that's available to you. And it's available to you because you abide by the principle. But you don't consciously abide by the principle. It's just that you represent the principle in the relevant kind of way, just as you might represent the syntactic principle of your language. So that's the sense in which the conscious state is available, even though the principle is not. And on the question about whether there are couldn't we just postulate, I take it you're asking, couldn't you just postulate other principles? Why am I hungry? Well, there's a principle. Why do I weigh whatever I weigh? Well, how do I know that I weigh that? Well, maybe there's a rule of rationality that says if you weigh this much, then believe that you weigh this much. And the thing is that, yeah, you could make that claim in principle, but I don't think it's very plausible as a principle of rationality. In the case of consciousness, I think it's really quite plausible that conscious states and beliefs about conscious states are very closely connected. I mean, think of the higher order thought theory, right? The higher order thought theory says a state is conscious because you have a belief that you're in it. Now, I don't think the higher order thought theory is a terribly plausible theory about consciousness, but I don't think it's a completely crazy theory, because it is quite plausible to think that beliefs that you're in conscious states and conscious states are quite closely connected. And so in this context, I think, yeah, that's quite a plausible claim. It's just that you shouldn't give it as an account of what a conscious state is. You should instead give it as an account of what introspection is, at least in a rational agent. So in a rational agent, conscious states and beliefs that you're in them go together. And I think that's a rather plausible thing to say. So I want to say that beliefs about conscious states and conscious states are really plausible. They're plausibly connected. And beliefs, ordinary states like physical states and beliefs about them are not plausibly connected in that way. And so that's roughly the principle. Maybe another way to put it would be the whole picture of rationality that I'm concerned with is a very broad picture. It says there's the whole ways of different mental states can be combined together in rational ways. If you imagine something, then you should believe it's possible. If you intend to do something this evening, you should believe that you will. If you perceive something, then you should accept the testimony of your perceptions. Likewise, if you're in a conscious state, you should believe that you're in it. It fits into that pattern. And so in those ways, I want to resist this idea that it's ad hoc and simply postulated to solve something. So that's, I guess, where I am on that issue.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And the last replica is going to Danil Loskutnikov, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, Mr. Stoljar. I hope you
Hello.
hear me well.
Yes, thank you.
I have two questions, not kind of objection, but clarification, I think. But I would like to ask them one after another. The first is following. According to your approach, to know that I believe that P, I ought to attempt to the content of P itself. Then, if I am rational according to the principle of introspection, I will automatically know that I believe that P, as far as I understood this. If it matters to me whether I believe that P. By attending to the content of the first order belief, I can gain knowledge, they say. But one can ask a bit in Dredskian style, how do I know about this they say, if the object of my attention is only the content of the first order proposition? I mean, given the content of P alone, how can I come to know that there are such contingent things as I and my mental attitudes at all? If the answer is that this knowledge is entirely derived from following the principles of rationality, a fundamental principle of rationality, such as R6, then isn't this knowledge something like substantial, I mean, non-trivial and non-formal knowledge a priori? But it could mean that some knowledge is really presupposed in introspection, namely some mastery of concepts such as I, belief, and might be even the mental. So another way may be to understand knowledge as derived in some crucial respects from our linguistic practices. But wouldn't it be a kind of deflation account? Could you clarify this point, please? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the basic question is, so there are two questions there. There's one question is about attending to the content, and another
Yes,
question is how this interacts with belief, they say.
Yes. When we are believing something, they say, isn't here a presupposition of some master of knowledge of such things as I believe and the mental at all?
Yeah.
And if it is presupposed, isn't it quite a trivial claim?
I see. Yes. So what I want to say about the attending to the content case is, let me talk about that, and then I'll talk about belief, they say. So in the case of attending to the content, what I want to say here is that when you attend to the content of a belief, that's what it is for the belief to be conscious in the relevant sense. So let's ask the question, what is it for a belief to be conscious? My answer is for you to attend to a sufficient degree, at any rate, to the content of that belief. Why is that? It's because when you attend to the content of the belief, that has an effect on the functional role of the belief. It makes the belief have a wider functional role than it would ordinarily have, and it makes it more likely to play the functional role than it would ordinarily do. And so that's why attending to the content makes the belief conscious in the relevant sense. Now, if the belief is conscious in the relevant sense, then if you're rational, you'll believe that you're in it. So that's the basic picture. So that attending to the content, what it does is it's the thing that makes the belief conscious in the first place. By itself, that's got nothing to do with introspection, because introspection is just a way that you have of coming to know that you're in conscious states. But there's two separate proposals. One proposal is, what is it for a belief to be conscious? And the answer is for you to attend to a sufficient degree to the content of the belief. And then there's another question, which is, what is it for you to come to know that you're in conscious states in general? Answer, for you to abide by this principle. And so you put those two ideas together, you'll get the result that you will know by introspection that you're in a certain belief, because you attend to the content of the belief that makes it conscious. And if it's conscious, it falls within the scope of this principle. So that's the basic picture, and that's why I talk about attending to the content. So it's not as if attending to the content, it's not as if attending to the content by itself tells you that you have the belief or something like that. It's attending to the content makes the belief conscious. That's part of the story. And the other part of the story is, if it's conscious, then the principle will tell you that you can come to know that you're in the belief, that you have the belief. So that's the picture. Now on the they say element, I guess there's two issues. First of all, the belief that you end up with when you believe that you have the conscious state, that's a they say belief, because you believe that you yourself have that state, are in that state. And that's a belief which you can't have unless, as you rightly say, you have the relevant concepts. You have to have the concept of a self and so forth. And so the introspective belief that you end up with is a they say belief in the relevant sense. And it is something that requires the features you mentioned. But that's kind of built in, because remember, the principle says you should believe that you're in the state only under certain conditions, namely in which, for example, you're psychologically capable of believing that you're in the state. And you'll only be psychologically capable of believing that you're in the state if you have the relevant concepts to form the they say belief. So in that sense, I think that's one way in which a they say belief enters. Now, maybe what you had in mind is that the belief that is the target of introspection, the one that you come to know that you're in, is itself a they say belief. What about that? What about, suppose it's the belief that I'm hungry or something, which is a they say belief. How do I know that I have the belief that I'm hungry? Well, the answer is I would still have to attend to the content of the belief. Now, there's a question as to what the content of they say beliefs are. And on the view that I'm most attracted to, the content of they say beliefs will be of a special sort. They'll basically be properties, not propositions. And that's a feature of they say beliefs. If you think of the content of they say beliefs as properties, not propositions, which I think is quite plausible, then you'll be attending to those properties, not to the propositions. So if they say beliefs have a special kind of content, then you can attend to that content and render the belief conscious, and then you'll believe that you're in it, just applying the standard principle. So that's one way of doing it. There is a complication, I suppose, and that is that on some theories of they say belief, they won't have a special kind of content. They will only there'll only be a special kind of state. And so that would mean that attending to the content, there'll be a mystery a little bit as to why attending to the content would make those beliefs conscious. But that's a complicated view about what those, what those theories of Daisy beliefs are. But certainly on the theory of Daisy belief that I guess I'm most attracted to, it'll have a special kind of content, and so attending to it can have the standard role that I imagine for it. So that's the way I would try to answer those questions. So basically, Daisy belief enters in two slightly different positions, at least in principle. One, the introspective belief that you form, the belief that you're in the state, that itself is a Daisy belief. And I don't think you can form that belief unless you have the relevant kinds of concepts. But it could also be that the belief that is the target of introspection is a Daisy belief. But then I think the standard theory applies, which is that belief will become conscious if you attend to its content, which you can even for a case of Daisy belief. And once it's conscious, the standard principle will apply. So that's the way I'm thinking about the way in which Daisy enters into that story.
Thank you for your answer. Just one more little thing about content and about one of application of your approach. As far as I understood, your answer to McKinsey's problem is to reject that premise 2 in the argument isn't a priori one. It seems to me that argument of this form must be derived from not from causal theories of reference, but from twin Earth and arthritis arguments in the first place. And while Putnam considers his argument to be non a priori and thinks it is kind of empirical hypothesis, Tyler Birch seems to think that his argument in support of externalism is in fact independent of any naturalistic supposition. And I think, in fact, it may be treated as a priori claim. Why again you think that Birch's argument is not really a priori first? And do you think if premise 2 and externalism were a priori, it would actually threaten your approach?
Yeah, the answer to the last question is yes, it would threaten my approach. If externalism turned out to be a priori, then that would be difficult for my approach, because the whole approach says that the McKinsey problem fails because externalism isn't a priori. On the Birch thing, what I say about the Birch thing is I say, yes, Birch uses twin earth arguments, as does Putnam, but it's not the mere fact that they use twin earth arguments or arguments from possible cases doesn't by itself mean that externalism isn't a priori or contingent, because there are arguments by possible cases for theses or against theses that are strictly speaking contingent. So the mere fact that they use arguments from possible cases doesn't actually tell us that externalism, what the modal status or the epistemic status of externalism is. Now, I guess you're making a slightly different point, though. You're saying Birch thinks of his argument, thinks of externalism as a priori. And I guess
yes, I think his arguments were independent from this naturalistic hypothesis about meaning, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, what Birch does is, what Birch's main point is that he can generalize the arguments by talking about social externalism and saying things like, I mean, Putnam originally applied it only to certain kinds of terms, natural kind terms and perhaps names and a few other things. What Birch says is that you can generalize this to any term you like because of social context. And that's maybe true or may not be true for my purposes, but I don't think as yet I've seen a reason to think that it isn't still a contingent matter, because it's still determined by the contingent psychological laws that are in place. And I have no particular objection to Birch's style of argument, or even that the kind of externalism, at least in this book, I have no objection to his style of argument, or even to the claim that externalism is true on the grounds that he gives. The point is that externalism is nevertheless a metaphysically contingent claim and an empirical claim in that broader sense, because it's determined by what the laws of nature are. And those are obviously empirical and contingent claims. And so if that's true, then that particular step in the McKinsey argument is a failure.
Thank you for answers.
Yeah,
Okay.
pleasure. Thank you.
It became clear.
Daniel, thank you. And
Mhm.
Daniel, traditionally the main speaker begins the seminar and the main speaker concludes the seminar with the final speech, maybe summarizing some main points or evaluating some expression, etc. So please.
Oh, well, let me just, first of all, just thank you again for organizing this. It's been terrific for me to work through these ideas and to try to make them clearer than I have so far. I guess the main issues were, well, I guess some of the biggest issues were this issue about ad hocery, whether it's just an ad hoc principle or not. And I would say in that case, let's revisit this in 5 years, because in 5 years' time, you might think of it as not an ad hoc principle, but absolutely axiomatic. So I suspect it'll move from something that seems very strange and picked out of the air to something that seems very obvious and central. And let's see. We can come back in 5 years' time and see. So let's just see that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a deal. We will see each other in 5 years, or I hope maybe even earlier, maybe in a year or two on some conference. Dear Daniel, thank you very much for this very instructive, very informative answers for not all our questions, but all the questions we were able to ask you. Thank you and see you again on our seminars and maybe somewhere
Thanks
else.
so much. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. I'll see
Yeah.
you very soon. I don't mean that I'll only see you in 5
Yeah.
years. I'm sure I'll see you before.
Yeah. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
See ya. Good night.
Thank you. Goodbye.